was a great. All right. See, it's good that it's being recorded now.
I'm seeing the next slide.
Exactly. Yeah, they can't see what you can see, but there is an additional slide here. Is that working? Am I on? Maybe I'm muted. There we go. Okay. Glad to be here this morning. And as I said, it was a wonderful day with the parade. Thanks folks like Johnny Stone, who have been stalwart with that float for years. And I think we carried on that rich tradition yesterday. Today, we're going to be talking about the tabernacle, the tent, or the temple. After an intense time in the wilderness, they have finally become a settled people. And just a little bit of review, David gets in trouble for dancing. Okay, have you seen this part? Do you remember this? Just a little bit of review. And then just a question, Chris, have you ever gotten in trouble dancing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there a story to that? Is there?
No, I'm just really bad with the white man overbite.
Okay. Just thank you for your help today. Thank you for your help. So as you recall, David gets in some trouble dancing. And you remember this from Calissa's work last week and from the sermon. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, okay, now we got the city of David. Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window, saw David leaping and dancing before the Lord. And then there's this line, and despised him in her heart. Despised him in her heart. And I just want to say this because I think this is important to remind us of. Relationships can overcome anything, we're told, except for one thing. They can overcome betrayal. They can overcome all sorts of things. They can overcome infidelity, but they cannot seem to overcome contempt. They say that this is the number one predictor of divorce. It is contempt. And when contempt creeps into a relationship, you know that you're in trouble. As the ark of the Lord came into the city, she despised him in her heart. Michal looked out at David and despised him in her heart. And for me, that is contempt. She looked at him with contempt for a variety of reasons. Some, maybe she just didn't like his dancing, Chris, but no, I mean, part of the reason is there's perhaps some resentment over her own father and who he was becoming. David is an embarrassment. But when she looks at him with contempt, that is a warning sign. And I just wanted to throw that out there as something to think about, because if you're starting to feel contempt somewhere in a relationship, it's time to seek help. It's time to get a second opinion. It's time to have a conversation. You can be annoyed. You can have a struggle with someone, certainly. But when it borders on contempt is when it can be more and more difficult, because things don't go well from there. They brought the chest of God and set it in the middle of the tent of pavilion that David had pitched for it. Then and there, David worshiped, offered burnt offerings, peace offerings. David had completed the sacrifices, and he handed out to each person in the crowd, men and women alike, a loaf of bread, a date cake, and a raisin cake. We need to do that some Sunday. You know, everybody who comes gets a date cake, a raisin cake, and a loaf of bread. I mean, that's how David showed hospitality, and maybe we need to do that as well. And then everyone went home. And then after everyone went home, we get the rest of the story. Saul's daughter came out to greet him. David returned home to bless his family. I don't know if that's a euphemism or not, but David returned home to bless his family. And because Michal, Saul's daughter, came out to greet him, and she says this: have you ever had a greeting like this when you've come home? How wonderfully the king has distinguished himself today, exposing himself to the eyes of the servants, maids, like some burlesque street dancer. That's the Message translation. That's not exactly what the Hebrew says. David replied to Michal, in God's presence, I'll dance all I want. He chose me over your father. Ooh, ouch. And the rest of our family, and made me prince over God's people, over Israel. Let's go to the next slide there, if you will. Have you ever come home to be greeted by sarcasm? Have you ever greeted someone who came into your home with sarcasm? You've been waiting all day. And as you've been waiting all day to say the thing that you have thought up in your mind and how great it's going to be, and it's going to be that one little dig that's going to get the other person that you supposedly love. And she says these kind of things. One of the things that I try to tell couples when they come in, even before they get married, or if we're in counseling, is to ask the question, is this a good time? Okay, is this a good time? Too often we get into trouble because our timing is off. Our timing can be off at work, our timing can be off at home, and we say things and the other person is not ready to hear them. We're ready because we've been thinking about it all day, and we see them, they walk into the office and we hit them. And one of the gifts you can give to other people is asking the simple question, is this a good time? Turn and look at somebody, say it to yourself there on Zoom. Is this a good time? Look at somebody.
Is this a good time?
And here's the rule, Brett. If this is not a good time, you need to tell me when a good time is. So if I come into your office, I don't always do that, David, but sometimes I do ask, is this a good time? And the idea is, if it's a good time, yes, I can have your full attention. If it's not a good time, you need to tell me it's not a good time. You need to tell me when a good time would be. It's a really helpful thing in strengthening relationships. Wherever you are is to honor the other person and to ask if this is a good time. This is not a good time for Saul, for Saul's daughter, and for David. So he returns home and she says that wonderfully sarcastic thing. And David replies, in God's presence, I'll dance all I want. And this gives some echo of some of the mistakes her father made. Do you remember that Saul got ahead of himself and made that sacrifice before he was supposed to? He was supposed to wait on the prophet, and Samuel was supposed to show up, and he gets ahead of himself. And I wonder if she also was worried a little bit that David's got a little ahead of himself. David's got a head full of steam, and he thinks and then he just, well, I just threw that in there. You can dance if you want to, just little men without hats. Anybody got that? Okay, good. Just check. And then he says these words here in yellow. He chose me over your father. That's just rough. That's just rough. This is like relationship no-nos 101, whether it's home or at work or wherever you might find yourself. He chose me over your father and the rest of our family, and made me prince over God's people, over all Israel. Oh yes, I'll dance to God's glory more recklessly even than this. As far as I'm concerned, I'll gladly look like a fool. And she's like, yes, you will. But among these maids you're so worried about, I'll be honored to no end. That's just not a kind thing to say. So what I see is that David hits back, is that she hits him with that sarcasm when he walks in the door. His response is to hit back. And I think that's often our response, especially as men, is that we want to hit back. We want to give back tit for tat. Somebody says something to us, and we tend to up the ante. And that is what he's done. He has upped the ante and has hit back. So I just wanted to review this. I thought Cliff did a great job with it, but this is like bad relationship 101, bad romance 101. Okay. He comes home to bless his family. He's full of himself. She hits him. And instead of him taking a deep breath, knowing that this is not the right time to address this, he hits back. And he begins to perhaps make some of the mistakes she's seen in her own father. And when she sees the mistakes he makes in his own father, she starts a script up that never ends. And when she starts to script up, the scripture text at the end of this says she never bore children after that. I mean, the hope was that Saul's line and David's line were going to unite in marriage, and that both warring camps were then going to be on the same page. You know, you've got Saul's family and the people who were loyal to Saul, and you've got this new upstart king, David. And the hope was to unite them in a child between Michal and David, and this does not happen. The scripture text tells us, sadly, she was barren until the very end of her life. And then the question that I just have for us to reflect on for a minute, at least as part of our time today, is how do we keep from escalating things? When things are going poorly, how do we stop it? How do we not be the ones who take things to the next level? It just happens very simply, but how do we stop being the ones to escalate the conflict? Because now we turn to David, and David here in chapter 7, we're told the king was settled in his house. How many of you are settled in your house? Anybody settled? You know, it's an interesting term to be settled in one's house. We had bought a house a few years ago and totally renovated it before we moved in. So we were feeling pretty settled in our house. We have bought a house now that needs renovation after renovation after renovation. And the people that we bought it from even said to our real estate agent, said, please make sure they understand what they're getting. Please make them understand what they're getting, that this is a renovation project. Anybody been there? A renovation project? Are still in that renovation project? And we feel sort of unsettled. And I have to admit to you, we have been thinking about what to do first. And we tried to build a fence, but then the posts, we couldn't even get the lumber to build a fence. And, you know, I have to admit to you, I don't think Elizabeth and I have sat down and prayed about which renovation to do next. We've discussed it. We've talked about it. But I don't know that we've literally sat down and prayed. We've prayed about a lot of things over the years together, but I don't know that we've sat down and prayed, what should we do first? The kitchen, the bathroom, the pool, the fence, the windows, you name it, there's something that needs to be done. And I don't know that we've sat down and done that. And so we're a little unsettled. But this is a great phrase here. It says, now the king was settled in his house. The king is seated in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies. Other translations say peace, not rest. Given him peace from all his enemies. This is a good time. This is a high point in his life. And maybe you can think back to the highest point in your life. Maybe it's right now, but this is the highest point in David's life. He is settled in his house. He's got a beautiful house, handcrafted, made of cedar, and the Lord has given him peace. He's at peace and he's settled. It's a pretty good place to be. And when he is at that place, he decides that maybe he should think about other people. You know, you've taken care of yourself for so long. Richard Rohr talks about in his book, Falling Upward, that there are two stages of life. That you begin in your life and you spend this time kind of acquiring and kind of putting together the container of your life, and you fill that container for the first half of your life. And at some point, you take a breath and you begin to think about the needs of others. And sometimes you don't take a breath because you want to. You take a breath because something hasn't worked out, because there's been a failing or a falling. And when that failing or that falling happens, then you begin to ask questions about, okay, what's next? What is the second half of my life going to be like? You can see there on the slide, he says the first half of your life is about fulfilling your ego needs, about establishing who you are, your identity, your security, your sense of boundaries, acquisition, affirmation, and some experience of success. And that seems to be what people are striving for. And that's certainly David. David has been striving for all these things in the first half of his life. And in the second half of life is conveyed by the sense of falling. That is one of the things that we've been dealing with this week. David's dealt with it in recent days as well. I don't know what's going on coming out of COVID, but people, as we've been coming out of COVID, there's been a lot of loss. There's been a lot of change. I mean, we've seen some people who were doing just fine who have died. We've seen people who have fallen, and that's one of the things that had to deal with last week is I left here not soon after this meeting because my father-in-law had fallen, my wife's stepmother had fallen, and then we found out that my wife's stepdad had a pulse of 190, and his blood pressure was like 80/40. I mean, it was rough. And instead of calling 911, she drove him to the hospital, and they said, "Don't do that again. Next time, call 911. Please have somebody come and get him." And so there's a fall that's involved. The fall is usually unheralded or unwanted, but occurs anyway. Such a fall can become the entry in a newer and deeper, broader world where one's soul is rediscovered. One's ethos, direction, and desire are fundamentally reordered. And you can fall down or you can fall upward. You can fall down and it can be your downfall, that forced to retire, or having a relationship fall apart, or whatever it might be, a disappointment in your own children, some disappointment in your own life, a demotion, whatever it might be. That falling can begin a downward spiral, or what Rohr says, it can be the deepening of who you are spiritually. And in that deepening of who you are spiritually, you begin falling upward. You begin falling forward in God's grace for you. And after you become settled in the house of cedar, are you looking for something else, or are for someone else? Or you're just going to sit and rest on your laurels. He says, the great purpose of life is to grow our unique God-given self and return or offer it in love and service to God and the world. It is to be the me I was created to be. And after you've spent so much time in acquisition, is there a time when you begin to think, okay, maybe this isn't all life is about. Maybe it's time to turn my life outward. So David is there. He's in 2 Samuel. He says, I'm settled in my own house. The Lord has given me rest from all my enemies. The king said to the prophet Nathan, see, I'm now living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in the tent. He goes to Nathan, and Nathan is the prophet. This is the first time we see him, but we're going to see him again, and Matt's going to cover this in detail in a couple of weeks. Nathan is the prophet who is able to speak the word of truth to the king. And that is a really important person in your life. Someone who is able to speak truth to you even when you don't want to hear it. And when you're the king, it's very difficult for anyone to speak the truth to you. I once worked with a bishop. He said, now that I'm a bishop, no one ever tells me the truth. Everybody always is hedging when they tell me things. You get to be the boss, and that people don't always tell you the whole story. They don't always tell you the truth. And you need a Nathan. You need someone in your life who's able to tell you the truth and do it in love. And he goes to Nathan and says, see, I'm living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent. He doesn't ask Nathan anything. And even in the Hebrew, it's not a question. Usually you would go to the prophet and you would ask a question. Should I do this? Do you think it'd be a good idea to build God a house? But instead, David is settled. You know, he is settled. He is accomplished. He's at peace. And he goes, okay, now it's time to turn my thoughts to someone besides myself. And I've got a great house. Maybe it's time to build God a house. It's a great, great image. And Nathan says to the king, go do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you. So when you're the king, you can declare and not inquire. And I wonder if Nathan has trusted that David has already inquired. He just has thought that David had such a close relationship with God, a man after God's own heart, that he had already asked God. So Nathan may have just assumed that David had asked God, but that does not seem to be the case. Because that same night, in our next slide there, so God speaks to Nathan. This is called the Oracle of Nathan, and it's one of the most important scripture passages in the whole Bible. You probably didn't know that you were getting the linchpin of the whole Old Testament here this morning. But that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. Go and tell my servant David. That word appears over and over again. I think it's 7, 8, maybe 11 times in this scripture passage, the word servant. trying to remind David who he is. Don't go tell King David. Go tell my servant David, thus says the Lord. And then God gets a little sarcastic just with David, just a little bit. He says, are you the one to build me a house to live in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle. God has been mobile, and this has been one of the gifts of the Hebrew God, that God was not stuck in one place, but God was able to go where the people are. And isn't that the gift of Christ in our lives? Is Christ goes with us wherever we are. It's not just gathering here in this place. We do come here to gather and to meet him, but God goes with us wherever. And God is not happy about this idea that David thinks he needs a house. But there's an interesting line in this. It says, I've not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day. Now, I heard a commentator say the other day that God's never lived in a house, but I just thought it was interesting. I haven't lived in a house since I brought the people up out of Egypt. So it made me think, did you live in a house in Egypt? You know, where did God live in Egypt? Did you live in a house when you were in Egypt? But God lived in the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was a portable way to allow God to be a mobile God for a mobile people. How many of y'all remember having home phones? Any of y'all still have a home phone? A couple of us still have a home phone. And we did it at our last house, and we didn't even know the number to it. You know, it was there. I think it came for free with our cable. But do you remember how you had to be tethered to a phone, or you had to go to a phone booth? And God is about to be restricted by David to a place. And God says, I'm not about any one place. I'm able to go where you go. But the people are becoming a more settled people versus a nomadic people. They're less wandering. And God is willing to build them a house, allow them to build a house for themselves, but not for him. It's like, you guys need this. You need a place to gather. You need a place to get together. You need a place to come and worship me, but I don't need this. I'm a mobile God, and I'm going to go where I need to go. I am not going to be restricted to any one place. God continues to speak through Nathan. Wherever I have moved about all the people of Israel, did I ever speak a word with any of the tribal leaders of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? God's like, I never asked for a house. I never asked for this. And yet you decided for me that this is what I needed. Has that ever happened to you? You decided for someone in your life that this is what you thought they needed. And so you began to provide that, and they didn't really want that. They perhaps wanted more of your time, but you spent more of your time trying to provide something that you thought they wanted. God's like, I'm a mobile God. I never asked for this. I never asked for this. I commanded you to shepherd my people Israel. I commanded you to see that others' needs are met first. That's what it means to be a shepherd. And then God gets pretty pointed. Now, therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the God of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep. It's almost like he's saying to David, you think you were a shepherd? You were a sheep far before you were a shepherd. You started out as a sheep. I took you from the pasture. I took you from following the sheep to be prince over my people Israel. And I've been with you wherever you went, and have cut you off from your enemies from before you. You got to keep things in perspective, David. These are the things I did for you. These are not your accomplishments. These are the things I did for you. I'll make you a great name like the name of the great ones of the earth. And God goes on, and I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more. Wish that was totally true for the people of Israel, right? That certainly is the hope, but that has not happened in the way that any of us would like. And be disturbed no more, and evildoers shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest or peace from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares that the Lord will make you a house. You think you need to make me a house? And it's a pun. And this is a dad joke from God. God is making a dad joke. God's like, you want a bayit, you B-A-Y-I-T in Hebrew, you want a bayit, right? You bayit, you want a house? I'll show you a house. I'm not going to make you a physical house. I'm going to give you another understanding of that word. I'm going to give you a dynasty. I'm going to give you a better house. I'm going to give you a lasting house, a house that would last forever, and one you don't have to renovate all the time, a house that will last forever. And then he says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish a kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, who's he talking about here? I hear Jesus, but let's get to Second Chronicles for that, or First Chronicles for that, because the next line is problematic if this is talking about Jesus, Chris. Okay, I'm with you, and he is talking, but First Chronicles gets rid of this next line, and we'll look. It's the exact same passage, but without this one line. It's fascinating. I will be the father to him, and he shall be a son to me. You hear that again in Hebrews. You hear that again in Second Corinthians. I will be a father to you and a father to my people, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortal use, with blows inflicted by human beings. And the struggle with that, and I'm glad you point that out, the struggle with that is that Jesus doesn't commit iniquity. And if Jesus does not commit iniquity, this is not just about Jesus. This is about the whole Davidic line, and specifically about Solomon. And Solomon's name means, anybody? Peace. So if David is to be one who brings peace, he literally does that in the form of a son whose name is Peace, Solomon. But I will not take my steadfast love from him as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and with this vision, Nathan spoke to David. And so what the biblical scholars will tell you is that this is the new covenant with David. And this is the promise that I will not leave you. I will not forsake you. My steadfast love, my hesed, will not leave you. It will be with you forever. You've heard Matt talk about sometimes the promise dangling by a thread all throughout the patriarchs and through the Exodus, and all the times when you worry about how God's work is going to be made manifest through the people of Israel. And now God is saying, listen, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to be with you forever, and the house of David will echo forever. And that's what happens in 2 Samuel 7. And if you read in 1 Chronicles 17, you'll find the exact same story minus this one line. I mean, it is almost word for word the exact same story, except for this line. When he commits iniquity, I will punish him with a rod such as mortals use, with blows afflicted by human beings. And so the thought is that as the people of God were trying to understand who this is about, this line gets deleted in the Chronicles passage and allows us to look forward to who Jesus is and who Christ will be in the lives of people when this line is taken out. Isn't that interesting? Did you ever notice that before? Brandon, you may not notice that before, but it's just that single line is taken out. So then in First Chronicles, David decides and says that Solomon will build the temple. David ordered all the resident aliens in the land to come together. He sent them to the stone quarries, and David gets together all the materials. He's not allowed to build the house. He's not allowed to build God's house, but he does get together all the materials in order to do this. And in 1 Chronicles 22:8, we're told why David doesn't get to build the house. 1 Chronicles 22:8, we're told You've killed too many people. You've fought too many wars. You are not the one to honor me for building a sanctuary. You've been responsible for too much killing and too much bloodshed. His name will speak peace. That is Solomon, which means peace. And I'll give peace and rest under his rule. He is the one who will build me a sanctuary. You won't get to do it. And then again in 1 Chronicles 28, you hear David talking again. But when I got ready to build it, God said to me, you may not build a house to honor me. You've done too much fighting, killed too many people. And sometimes in our violence, we are not able to get to what that we fully want to do. And this really is a time where David is told no. It's kind of two things in a row. You've got the ark, and they're not supposed to touch the ark, and David is told no. And then here he says to God, I'm going to build you a house. And everything seems to have been going great for David until this time. And then David is told no. And I think it's the mark of a man to know who we are and how we deal with it when we get a no. When we get a no, how do we deal with a no? Do we let it destroy us? A friend of mine was running for office and was told, if you can't lose, don't run. Because if you can't lose, it will destroy you. It will take a chunk out of you and you will never be the same. I've seen that happen to people. I talked about that one day with Fran, that if you can't lose, don't run. And so how do we deal with our no is as important as how we deal with our yeses. So I've got some questions for us to ponder. And the questions are these. And I just have that note at the beginning. Please, if you're feeling contempt for your spouse or someone else in your life, please have a conversation with David, with Matt, with me, with someone. I wouldn't love to have that conversation, but I'd like to have that conversation so you're not trying to deal with that alone, because it can really deteriorate and if contempt has crept into your life. So I'd ask you, how would you describe where you are in life today? Are you settled or unsettled? Just kind of take a vote around your circle. Are you settled or unsettled? Are you striving, thriving, or just surviving? Do you think you're in the first half of your life still or the second half of your life? And that does not have anything to do with age. Does not have anything to do with age. You can be in your first half of your life much earlier. I read a beautiful thing about Helen Keller, who was in the first half of her life much earlier than most people. She had some constrictions that made that happen, but she could have dealt with it differently. Who would you say are your enemies today? And are you at peace with them? How do we keep from escalating conflict? How to remember from whence we came, our beginnings. That is what David is reminded of. Don't you remember you were just a sheep. You were just a shepherd boy. Don't get too big ahead for yourself. You didn't accomplish all this by yourself. What might be the legacy you are leading or leaving? I'm playing with that phrase. What's the difference between leading a legacy and leaving a legacy? One seems to be active, one seems to be passive. And how often do you ask for the Lord's leading in your decision making? What could help you to consider that more often? Thanks for your time and attention today as we continue to dance awkwardly with David. Discuss among yourselves.